Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. My name is Rachel Brickel and I'm a multidisciplinary artist. Big thanks to Maxon for giving me a space to share. First, I'd like to show you my reel to kind of give you an idea of the type of work that I do and some of the projects I've had the opportunity to be a part of.
Always like to play with
Rite of passage, classic habit, matching the gas tank. Ooh, that's right, shit. Unstoppable, legendary animal. Digital justice, now you're gonna know what's hail to the king and queen of the ruckus. Young money wired, no denying. I've always liked to play with fire.
I'm an art director and designer, but I also really love to work with Cinema 4D for animation and design. I also love doing these more experimental types of macro tabletop shoots. So Cinema 4D is really what got me into motion graphics. It really started just by me playing with these abstract shapes and cameras. And when I did that, I felt very inspired and it got me excited and it made me feel like this is what I want to do. Like I feel like I fit here. So Cinema 4D is really where my roots are, and because of that I always try and incorporate it in whatever way I can to help aid me in telling stories. So today I'd like to go over with you certain guerrilla type tactics that I use in my workflow. I will specifically be going over certain tips and tricks when it comes to boards, pitches, and my own ideation process. After that I'll be going over how I approach camera rigs in Cinema 4D. And I'll be using very specific projects as examples for how I go about doing these things. The first two I want to go over and share with you are from Current Studio, Black Magic, and Duello, and I'm very excited to share these with you. After that, I will be sharing the Bastard Executioner that was done with the internal team at FX Networks, along with Prodigal Pictures. And then after that, I'll be sharing the semi-permanent opening titles for 2019 that were done with Elastic.
So the first piece I want to kind of go over is Black Magic. Black Magic was done with Kenneth Kegley, Rachel Ma, and Unha Choi. It was the first time that I was given an opportunity to art direct, so I went super hard on this one. It was a piece that was kind of focused around Maya Huel, who was essentially a female deity, but in this case she was the goddess of the agave, and we were kind of trying to show this awakening of her as someone was trying to harvest the agave to make mezcal, and upon her awakening it led to the environment becoming undone and disturbed. So the challenge of this piece was to find ways to incorporate the branding, but to do it in a way that felt concept driven. So after some brainstorming, I thought to use 3D prints. So I modeled the logo in Cinema and had them printed. And Jose Ponce printed these actually. He's a 3D generalist who happens to own the Form 1. And just to show you what they turned out like this. And they come out with these scaffoldings, and most people get more excited about the scaffolding than the actual 3D print. So I used them as stamps, and that's how I created this shot. I just used it and pressed it into different mediums to create these macro moments. And I really wanted to showcase this typography because it was so beautiful. And here's another look at a couple of them. And the idea never was to just shoot the 3D print itself, but this one came out so cool that we ended up shooting on it super macro and poured liquid on top and did all these chemical reactions, and it made it into the sequence. I think that 3D printing things gives you the opportunity to get your hands dirty and do these more guerrilla style experiments. So I really love 3D prints. This is a print that I printed for another set of boards that I did for something else. you can really make anything. And you know, there really is no comparison to being able to texture and light in practically. So we spent all this time trying to texture and light in 3D, but if you can take that 3D thing and shoot it, it's gonna have such a nice look that's very hard to match in 3D. I just want to share this one with you real quick. This one was just meant to be a FXX logo, but it was a fuck up, so it came out like this. But I think that's really cool because it's like this little sweet spot where you have this happy accident happening to the 3D that you make. So I think that's super cool, and you can't really recreate that. And that's the reason why we shoot stuff. We want these happy accidents. So I think that's a really cool merger between the two. For Duello, Kenneth Kegley, Rachel Ma, Unha Choi, and I developed the story of this Alebrije that would be fighting in battle with another Alebrije. And I always love working with current because it's always this fun, raw, experimental energy, and that's really hard to come by.
So what I want to show you is some behind the scenes for Duello. And this is just some development I was working on for the armor for the Alebrije. And what an Alebrije is a creature that has many different parts, or is made up of many different parts. And in this case, it was a black rabbit that was mixed with a rooster and a snail. And this is just some more look development. So when the client saw these, they got excited about it because they felt like the spikes were just ejecting in this way that felt very aggressive. I only laid it out this way just to show different lengths. So it was cool to have that back and forth with them. So that then spiked an idea to make these boards. And these are just some of the boards that I was able to contribute. I was able to pose the model that we had using Adobe Mixamo to help us figure out what the end pose would be.
Bhakti Patel and Jilmaya Berra helped to create this amazing 3D model of the Alebrije, as well as concept design with the armor. And these two are amazing 3D goddesses.
Of course, the model does a lot of the work. So all I had to do really was kind of solo out certain parts of this model to help try and develop the story. As you can see, this model is one piece. One little trick I like to do to break up a model so that I can abstract certain parts is to separate the model. So first let's go to mesh and then conversion and polygon groups to object. And what that's going to do is it's going to break apart the object into several pieces. And it's great because the model itself has the metadata to be able to do that, so that you can actually utilize the different parts. So here you go. Now we have everything split up into different parts, which is great. You can even pick apart these feathers. So you have a lot of control here now, which is great for boards. I can like move this wing and everything. So what I'm going to show you today is how I used Adobe Mixamo to pose this character to help try and figure out some of the fighting stances in the boards for the sequence. So Adobe Mixamo doesn't like when you have a lot of parts. It gets confused by it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just take out the body because that's all we really need, because we can put these individual parts back on it once we get a very simple rig going on this guy. So right now he doesn't have eyes, so I'm going to at least take that part. That should be fine. And I'm just going to swoosh these guys back in. Hey. And that doesn't look right yet. Hold on. Make him a little less creepy. One little trick I like to do is pressing S, which gets you to what you're selecting. So if you're doing something like this, you're trying to get those eyes in there evenly. I am just going to solo this part out, and I'm going to, oops, sorry, working from Macs and PCs, hotkeys are off. A Command X, and I'm just going to take that out. Command V, so now I have everything out of that group. I'm going to group that. I'm going to save this for later. And now we have our little simplified alebrije here. So I am now going to combine these parts because we don't really need to be moving his eyes. Combine objects, delete. So the next thing we have to do to get him ready for Adobe Mixamo is make him in T-pose. So most models need to be prepped in this way so that they can be rigged and moved evenly. So you always want to start in T-pose. This model isn't currently in T-pose, so we're going to have to just have to try to do this in a very Frankenstein way. All the modelers are probably screaming at me for doing it like this, but so I'm just going to kind of go in here and loosely pick apart his arm because we're just going to rotate it into place, and I'm just going to make sure nothing's going on in his armpit. There's not any weird parts that we don't want. Looks pretty good. And then I'm going to use this to kind of judge getting him nice and straight. So I'm going to rotate him, get his arm back up there, make sure the polygons aren't getting pinched too much. And I'm just going to try and get this as straight as possible. And now I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. We want to try and make it as symmetrical as we can, but I'm basically just eyeballing it. It really doesn't have to be perfect. We're just doing this for boards. And a lot of times when you're working at boards, there are quick deadlines, so you really don't have to be super technical about it. So now I'm going to rotate this guy. Trying my best to make it symmetrical. Okay, that feels pretty good to me. So now that I have him, I'm going to export him as an OBJ. I like to use OBJs for Adobe Mixamo. Called this guy test 11. And this will take a little bit to load. Looks like our OBJ finished exporting, so I want to take this over to Adobe Mixamo. That's mixamo.com. There's a bunch of different animations here, and the great thing about this website is you can upload any of your models and you can actually give it these animations and it will actually generate a rig for your model. So let's upload our alebrije. So here's our model. Now we just have to make sure he's front and center and go next. So because we built this really haphazardly, you don't have to have symmetry on. I'm gonna leave that off just because I didn't do a perfect job. And then first I'll start with the chin. Now through trial and error, I learned that the chin doesn't necessarily have to be, I mean, this isn't really a humanoid, so it's a little bit different when you're working with creatures. So his chin is kind of shallow, so I'm just gonna move this up a little bit higher than you would think based on the reference. And then I'm going to put these on the wrists. His wrists are a
little bit closer in because he doesn't really have wrists. Let's turn symmetry on just so we can have these moving at the same time. We'll turn it back off. And then this is for elbows. We're just gonna kind of keep it in between the wrist just for placement's sake. And then the groin here. Put the knees here because his knees would be here because he has chicken legs. Then we'll turn symmetry off. So you can kind of like perfect it if your model wasn't perfect. Try to get it in the middle. And then they actually have an option for no fingers if you don't have fingers. So you should select that if that's the model that you're working with. And then we're just gonna say next. And it's going to run it through an algorithm and generate a rig for us. Here he is. Here's our guy. Just finished generating. His face is a little fucked up, but that's fine. He doesn't look like he has any teeth. But you know what? It doesn't matter because we're just gonna pose him for boards. So let's press next. Here we go. Here he is. So let's give him a little animation. So you can make him dance. You can do all kinds of things. Some of my favorite dances. So this is the type of stuff you can do with any model. Very fun. Oh shit, gotta see this. Oh, okay. Anyway, oh shit. All right. Let's do this one. That's how I dance anyway. Let's download this. All right. So let's make a new one. I'm just gonna drop this bad boy in here. And here it is. See, we have a nice little rig going on here, and it's totally malleable. Check all this out. This is super awesome. And you know, I'm not even a rigger, and this guy is rigged, so great tool to use. And this is fully manipulatable. See, we can move his foot now, and his skin will stick. Can move his leg. It's great. And usually what I do is let's see, we can put this to like 1,000. Kind of. So what you want to do is, what I do anyway, is I select all of them. So you want to unfold all. Let's make sure you have all of them selected, and that's going to let you show you all of the keyframes. I'm going to select all of them. And then I'm going to delete them. So now we don't have any animation. So now we can actually move him and keep our pose. And now we have a rig. He already looks like he's about to fight somebody. So the way I approach the boards, I actually like put all those additional items back on. And individually pose them. So it is a little tedious, but it's a lot less work than actually rigging them and doing all of that. And the idea is just to get the point across. So you can Frankenstein them and do everything like that. And I did many different versions.
As for treatment, I didn't really treat it that much. I actually did most of the comping in Photoshop because the idea of it was to just get ourselves the pose and be able to mock it up and then add the detail on from there. So I made these frames to show the spikes coming out from the alebrijes shell. And I lit these very minimally. This one only has one light. I'm just gonna move this guy back and forth so you can see. So I'm getting all of this from one light, and that's really all I want. I'm trying to do a more dynamic look, dynamically lit look, so and minimal look. So that's why I'm using one light. Just to show you my light settings, I have this at basically 10. And you know, a big part of it too is the size of the light. You know, so I try to make this thing kind of wide so it has a big area, so that, you know, we're using one light. So I made it a pretty big one so we can kind of see what we're doing, because if it was small it would kind of be a little hard to figure out what was working. But if you want to do that, you can, and you can make it look a little more like this. So, but you know, sometimes you want it lit enough so that you know what you're looking at. So I try to light it a little bit more, but and crunch it in post, because sometimes it's nice to light something enough so that you can go into post and then crunch it to make it even more minimal. So lighting it just a little bit more than you actually want is a good way to give yourself that flexibility in post. Jump into this one. So for this guy, I lit him with as you can see, I'm using only 2 lights. I have one light from behind, which is what's giving us that rim light. And I have one light that's kind of at a 3/4 angle from the side, and that's kind of what's giving us this fall off. And because it's at a 3/4 angle and not straight on, it gives us that fall off. The thing about lighting black is it's very hard, especially when it's on a black background, because your black item might get lost. Also, when you want to give it that rim light, sometimes your light has to be pretty hot just because you're lighting a black object. And when you're doing that, you risk having an overexposed rim light, which doesn't look very good either, unless that's the look you're going for. And then also you want to be careful with your lights, because you don't want to overlight the black object, because if you do, then it just becomes gray, and then that kind of defeats the purpose of it looking black. And I don't think you want to make your black object look gray. If you wanted to look gray, you would just have a gray object. So I think it looks really cool when you have more dynamic lighting like this, so we can kind of like hint at the shapes that are at play and let everything kind of fall off into shadows, which makes it kind of cool and ominous. Yeah, so that's kind of how I do those types of looks. Mocking up camera angles in Cinema 4D is a great time saver, because you can kind of try out a bunch of different things and figure out what's most interesting, and that can save out a lot of time on set. So, and spark ideas. So I had this idea of getting a view of the alebrije as it stepped down before it leaped up into battle, into that fighting pose. So the way I built it was just really just having like a little panel here, just to sell the idea of like, hey, let's put a camera underneath and have some plexiglass so that we can see through it. And this is kind of what the render looks like, just to kind of show and give an idea of the lighting. And
so from there, Current and Mezcal worked together to create this set, and the plexiglass was made so big that the talent could walk on it. And that's just the coolest thing about the creative process, because people are always riffing off of each other and trying to push ideas even further. So this thing became its own standalone teaser. For the Bastard Executioner, this pitch was done completely in-house at FX Networks. I worked very closely with Steve Viola, Cinderella Pang, and Jane Rowe. And then Danny Yunt executed the boards that we created in this massive shoot. So it was a completely collaborative project, and it was one of the first times I felt the full weight of working with a team. So what I really want to take you through is my process from ideation with 3D to using very simple 3D and comping it for boards. It first really started out just with some sketches. I had this idea of a warrior with nothing left of him except for his teeth left behind. And I thought this was a good representation of the loss of identity that can come from battle. And I was just trying to think of different ways to abstract medieval war. And I wanted to think of different symbols of things that I could model, that I could share with the team that were generic enough, but also were in a way concept driven. So I modeled this helmet, and as you can see, it's very simple. It's just like my doodle. And I modeled these swords, and I tried to model 3 because I was trying to give some flexibility to the team. And I knew I wanted to put a sword in my boards, but I just had to think of what I wanted to do. So I started thinking about what it would be like if you were fighting in a medieval war and in Europe. And I thought, well, it'd probably be raining. So I started thinking about mud. And then I started thinking about metal, because the sword was metal and the helmet was metal. And I got this idea about, well, what if the sword itself was melting into the mud? And we got this mix of metal and mud as a texture, showing the idea of the toxicity of war and the poison that it is and how it corrupts. And so I ran home and I grabbed some mud off the side of the sidewalk, and this was the day the pitch was due. So I only had like 2 to 3 hours, and I had my boyfriend stick his hand through some mud, and I poured metallic paint on his hand and had him hold a kitchen knife. And I quickly ran back into the office and put everything together super quickly, and I had some reference in a folder. And Steve came in and he saw it on my screen and he got super excited by it. And the next day he wanted to make a spot. He had this big idea of having all these people that were fighting in the mud and having them solidify and become stone and become this massive tapestry. And the tapestry would then exist within this rune that was actually at the top of the sword. It was a symbol of the main character's sword. So that became the overarching concept of the entire piece. And he tasked me with trying to figure out different vignettes to work into the sequence. So here are some sketches that I made, just kind of isolating different little cool moments that I was trying to brainstorm. And they aren't the best sketches, but it was enough to get the point across. And I then made this deck showing different reference imagery and just breaking down the different ideas that could happen. And Anderson Savatke, he drew these awesome sketches to better sell the idea. And from there, we really floored it and tried to make this sequence together. So I'm going to walk you through how I use Cinema 4D in making these boards. It was really just a mix of very basic 3D and photo bashing. And I'm just going to show you here the way I use Cinema 4D in my workflow. So first I'll start out with this helmet. So I took the helmet and I textured it and lit it. Sculpted some of these little details in here using the sculpt tool in Cinema 4D just to add some imperfections. And the great thing about Cinema 4D is you can try all different kinds of angles just to kind of figure out what your story is. And that's something you lose when you're just finding stuff on Google because you're just grabbing images that are already as they are. You can't just move the camera around in them. So Then took that and painted a bunch of things that I had shot onto it and some textures found from Google. Just to show you what some of these textures are doing. Just sitting on the base of the model. And even painted in some of the lighting. Because it doesn't have to be perfect in 3D. The idea is just to have the map of the image and then to use that and paint on top of it. Just to show you what some of this looks like underneath. And then I used these adjustment layers just to bake everything down so they look like they're one cohesive piece. And I did the same thing for these boards, just to show you the original. So that's what this looks like. It's literally just like the most shitty 3D you've ever seen, but underneath all these awesome layers, it looks pretty good. Same thing here. Again, just really basic model put under all these cool layers. And just to show you again, he really needs to brush his teeth, but that's this is just a bunch of images from Google put in to make it look like a real horse. Just showing you what some of these layers do. And there are hundreds of layers. And this is what the 3D looks like for that. Again, you can do so many different angles in 3D. It's awesome. You just build one setup and you can make a ton of boards out of it. So really experimented with different angles. So these were some screenshots from the pilot of the show, and I really loved these helmets. I thought that if we had this really cool warrior helmet, it'd be awesome if the horses also had helmets, just so we can kind of further on that idea of juxtaposition. So I had saw Kim model this guy in ZBrush. So this is how it came out. It looks super cool. So I textured and lit it in Cinema 4D, and it came out like this. These are the two different. And this is the other helmet. I modeled this one because it was much more simple to make. And Brian White got this cool dragon and put it on top in ZBrush. And that's how I got the little dragon guy on Saw's helmet. I just kind of combined the two and just painted it in there, again using the same method. This is just some low-res thing I grabbed from Google, and using these adjustment layers you can't even really notice, and it's all baked down together and looks pretty good together. And for this one, this was the rune. And this was that model that we built. So I started it out by just putting together like a few cylinders, like very simple. And then I handed this to Brian White, and he did the ZBrush to give it these, give it this texture. Just showing you what that looks like. being able to matte paint a bunch of stuff together is a huge time saver. It can really get you some great results. So what I'm really trying to hammer in here is just you can really make something really cool with the most basic 3D render. So you don't necessarily need to know Octane or Redshift, but if you do, it's awesome. But you know, if you're a matte painter and you're able to paint all these details, that's awesome too. And you can use that skill to paint in all these details and make something look really good. Just coming from the perspective of a designer. So another one, for example, the internal layers of it look like this. And this is really just the technique we used to build these things. Just a bunch of reference images all painted in together, and you know, some even the matte lines aren't even really fully cleaned up, but when you paint them together, it ends up looking really cool like this. The next one I'm going to show you is the semi-permanent opening titles. This was done with the amazing Hazel Baird and Heidi Berg at Elastic and this enormous team. So my role in this was animation. One of my favorite things to do in Cinema 4D is work on camera moves. So I animated the camera for this sequence as well as the character animation. Just showing you some of the previs animation that went into this. And Margarita Primoroso painted all this amazing 2D cell animation on top of the 3D. So it was a really great combination of 2D and 3D joining together. So I really enjoy making more dynamic camera moves. Some of these were more simple and some of them were more dynamic. And I've never animated a character before, but I just wanted to contribute in any way that I could. And I was just blocking out the character in the previs, and they ended up really liking it. So I ended up animating the character in most of the shots. Love animating dynamic camera moves because in real life you're limited to like how much money you have, you're limited to what equipment you can rent, you need a whole crew. Like in 3D you can animate whatever you want and the sky's the limit. Like you can make any kind of rig, you can do all these unworldly camera moves that you can't even really do in real life. So I think that's really fun, and I always get excited about doing it for that reason. So this is the only file I have offhand. It's extremely hard to get files during a pandemic, but luckily this is a cool one. So just showing you here, the move in Cinema. So I just wanted to show you how I built my camera. Now, I usually don't add any keyframes to the camera itself. I have it sitting in a null for rotation, and this is just general rotation. And I put that under a Dutch angle type of null. And the reason for that is so that I can do these cool secondary Dutch angles and still have that rotation control. And it's very important that this is your normal rotations are sitting under this, because this is really just a secondary thing that happens on top of that. And then I control position above that. I love to keep them organized in this way so that I don't get, I just like compartmentalizing the different types of movement just so I can keep focused on what's doing what. And the other thing that I like to do is incorporating a target. So you can just make a null and then make that your target. And the way I'm moving this one to do this move, I just have it sitting on his face, and then I have it come to the center and the camera will follow it. And then as I'm coming out, Hazel and Heidi wanted to make sure that they've finished centered. So that was very challenging to do smoothly. And using this target really helped with being able to bring us from centered face to face to centered body to body. So it gives you a lot of control. And then I like to have all of that then sitting in a another null. And this is just the null that houses everything. So if I need to make any last minute adjustments or just shift things left or right or little things like that, I can do that without messing up my camera animation.
All right, so let's start from scratch. Let's make a camera. Make sure to zero everything out. You always want to start at 0 so you don't mess up your axes and your pivots. That's how I do it, at least. Everyone has their own way of doing it. So I'm going to group it like 3 times. Call this guy rotation. Call this guy for Dutch angle. Make this guy position. Then I'm going to group that in a full camera group. And now you can move it. And let's say we move this in. Notice that the pivot has stayed in the center of the camera, or where it's supposed to be, in all of these nulls. And we can move it left, right. It doesn't affect our pivot. So that's what we're after from this grouping. So, just move this back. Just undoing. So, let's try something. Just gonna move this down, make her a little smaller. Let's put this guy in a null. So let's say you have a moving object. Starts, or well, ends here. It starts here. Okay. And let's say we want the camera to follow it. So we're just going to pop this guy in here. Now we have it following it, which is great. That's what we want. Now let's take it a step further. Oh, and before I get into that, the reason why I'm doing it like this is so that it will follow your position movement, but you can also do things like this where you animate the position of your camera, and you can kind of have it catch up with your object. So you have it, let's say you want it to go past it eventually. So let's say it goes there. So now it'll move with it, but it'll move at a different pace, but it'll still be within that grouping. So just showing you that. All right, so let's make it more interesting. Let's make a null. Put under this guy. Set everything to 0 so it falls into place in the center. This is going to be our target. Let's make this target. All right, so now this is how target works, if you don't know already. So now it's doing like this cool follow through. Showing you what this looks like. Gets really in there. A little too back and forth at the moment, so the way we can solve that is just by moving. Position for it to be a bit more to the left here, so we can kind of arc around it now as it passes by.
So we don't want like a yo-yo situation. And there you go. We have this really cool dynamic thing going on. Let's say we wanted to put in a little Dutch angle. It's this guy. Start just before I do this. I don't know. Let's do something like that. See how it looks. Who knows? Oop. It's kind of cool. So this is what it's doing. It's creating that movement, in case you couldn't notice. So yeah, it feels a little more dynamic. See? When it gets close, it's doing something cool here. I know this is a really simple example, but this is how I approach camera moves. That pretty much concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for watching. You can find me at Rachel Brickel on Instagram. It's literally just my name. Again, thank you, Maxon, for giving me this opportunity to share with everybody. For those of you who haven't jumped in too much with Cinema 4D, I know it can be intimidating at times, but it really doesn't have to be so technical. Just don't forget to have fun and try to play, you know. Just try and make some cool shit. All right, thanks guys.